Hey, and welcome. This is the Ben Shapiro Show. Got a lot coming up for you this hour. A little bit later on in the hour, we will be talking about China and Hong Kong. It appears that maybe a trade deal is imminent, which would be good news for President Trump on the economy. Probably not great news in the Cold War between the United States and China effectively is already taking place. But we begin this hour with an amazing, amazing piece from the Washington Post about the Constitution and what it means to folks on the left. And it really does demonstrate that for a lot of folks on the left, the Constitution is merely symbolic for a bunch of stuff I like. And meaning that the Constitution doesn't actually have words in it or doctrines. It doesn't establish checks and balances or anything. The Constitution is shorthand for, if I like it, then it's probably in the Constitution. And if I don't like it, then the Constitution forbids it, which is not the purpose of the Constitution. So the piece is from Peter Marks, who's the theater critic over at the Washington Post. This is the same guy, I believe, who wrote those insane theater reviews of Elizabeth Warren. Okay, he has a piece today called What the Constitution Means to Nancy Pelosi and Barbara Streisand, among other Americans. Apparently, there is a new play called What the Constitution Means to Me by Heidi Schreck. It's a performance piece, a Broadway hit this past season, a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for Drama. The work comes to the Kennedy Center this month, with Schreck continuing as its star. A national tour with a new actress begins in L.A. early next year. Taking the form of a poignant and funny memoir, the play recounts Schreck's participation in American Legion contests in which students tested their mastery of the U.S. Constitution. Over the course of 100 minutes, Schreck manages to vibrantly animate a document that some people may have consigned to the dry parchment archive of their memories. In the spirit of civic-minded outreach that Schreck's play engenders, says this theater critic, we asked some leading American figures in politics, media, the arts, and the law about what the Constitution means to them. Now, you might think that when you say leading figures in politics, media, the arts, and law about the meaning of the Constitution, you might get somebody slightly to the right of Karl Marx. Nope, wrongo. The Washington Post theater critic did not have a Republican in his Rolodex, so it is instead just a list of all of his leftist friends. And what they have to say about the Constitution should disturb you, because that's not the way the Constitution is supposed to work. So here's Nancy Pelosi describing the Constitution. Quote, in their great wisdom, our founders enshrined our most sacred freedoms in the First Amendment, which is the guardian of our democracy and of all the liberties that come after it. In the People's House, we are entrusted with the sacred responsibility to protect those liberties for the American people and to advance a future that honors both the words of our founders and the well-being of generations to come. Sounds nice, except that if Nancy Pelosi had her way, presumably there would be hate speech legislation. Nancy Pelosi is pushing forward the Equality Act that routinely cracks down on people's religious freedom. Nancy Pelosi is very much in favor of preventing people from spending on elections. Nancy Pelosi, in fact, is no friend of the First Amendment. So what she really means by that is stuff I like, because her policies run in direct contrast to the actual First Amendment. How about Barbara Streisand? What does she have to say? First of all, who cares what Barbara Streisand has to say about the Constitution? Like, where's her law degree? Can she say how many articles are in the Constitution? Can she name the first 10 amendments, for example? She says the 14th Amendment of our Constitution actualized feelings. No, she says the 14th Amendment of our Constitution actualized what many of the founders wanted, promoting equal protection under the law for all Americans. If I could, I would end the antiquated Electoral College. So I love this. She thinks that the 14th Amendment cuts against the Electoral College. The Electoral College is in the Constitution, lady. Pretty sure that the Constitution has that whole thing in the Constitution about the Electoral College. But basically, she believes, as apparently does Chris Hayes on MSNBC, that if it were not for the Constitution, the Electoral College would be unconstitutional. Yes, and if it were not for the Constitution, then the First Amendment would also be unconstitutional, because by definition, what is in the Constitution is constitutional. Like, what in the world are you talking about? I do love it when Democrats start talking about how terrible the Electoral College is because it's unrepresentative. Have you heard of this thing called the United States Senate? Because that one's real weird, guys. I'm like, I don't mean to like bust in on your one man, one vote fantasies, but the U.S. Senate is pretty unrepresentative. Montana, which has like 9 people, has as many votes in the U.S. Senate as California, which has 50 million people. There are more Congress people than senators in the state of Montana. Okay, because rather than more senators than Congress people in the state of Montana. There are 2 senators in Montana and 1 congressperson because there are so few people. And yet they have equal votes. Obviously, we must abolish the United States Senate, according to Barbara Streisand. She says twice in the last 20 years, the popular vote winner was denied the presidency. This is an assault on our democratic principles where the dictum should hold true. 1 person, 1 vote. Thank you, legal scholar Barbara Streisand. And now she's going to sing to you from Yentl. Luis Miranda Jr., board chairman of the Latino Victory Fund and founding partner of the Moram Group and father of Lin-Manuel Miranda. He says, first in our Bill of Rights, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press because it is a key to our future as a nation. It is no surprise every time I hear President Trump say or hear him or see him tweet, the fake and corrupt media is so bad for our country, the enemy of the people. I cringe. Our society relies on an honest and dependable press. Well, then we're boned. I mean, our honest and dependable press? Yeah. And sometimes a negative press review can close a Broadway show or derail a promising political career, but it can also move a country like Puerto Rico to get rid of corruption or portray pain so vividly that millions are moved to show generosity, as they did in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. Our founders got it right. Again, I agree that the founders got it right on freedom of the press. If you really believe that Trump attacking the credibility of the press is an attack on the freedom of the press, you are missing the entire point of his critiques. Again, I don't like the enemy of the people stuff either, but that's not what the First Amendment is about. You're allowed to criticize the press. Lawrence Tribe, who's gone off his rocker, he's a professor at Harvard Law School, used to actually, know things, but apparently Trump derangement syndrome has now addled his brain. He says, to me, the Constitution is more verb than noun. Well, then you should learn grammar, because it's literally a noun. This is less a bequest from a few inspired but flawed white men than a challenge to build a more perfect union, a fairer and more equal nation from their hopes and ideals, and from the dreams of those who marched and fought and died to make those ideals real. So in other words, he wishes the Constitution didn't exist because you don't need a Constitution for any of that stuff. And the Constitution is a set of ideals, encoded and enshrined in a system. The part of the Constitution that is most important, you'll notice that it is fascinating, and this is common on right and left, unfortunately. People love to talk about the Bill of Rights and the amendments to the Constitution. Nobody ever likes to talk about the actual content of the Constitution, meaning like before the Bill of Rights, before the amendments, the systemic Constitution, all the stuff about the checks and balances and the delegated powers and the role of government. In fact, it was very controversial as to whether the Constitution should include a Bill of Rights in the first place. Why? Because anti-federalists argued for it, and federalists said, guys, the problem is once we enumerate these rights, we are sort of implying that there are no other rights to protect against government encroachment. And that's why the founders enshrined the Ninth Amendment, which suggests that powers not delegated to the federal government are held by the states or the people, respectively. But the part of the Constitution that matters most is the system. The system was supposed to be the guardian against invasions of your rights, not the Bill of Rights, which is just a bunch of words on a piece of paper. It was the system, because the system is what works. But not according to the left. The left only likes to focus on the amendments because the truth is they hate the system. So they like the amendments because the amendments can be twisted and turned like a kaleidoscope, and you can view them through a bunch of different angles and finally come up with, if you just squint right, exactly their favorite policies. They don't like the system in the Constitution. And that's the common thread in all of these leftists talking about the Constitution. They don't like the system. They don't like the Electoral College. They don't like the checks and balances. They don't like the independence of the branches. They don't like any of that stuff. What they do like is the grand verbiage, because they can twist the verbiage. Representative Elise Stefanik of New York, who is supposedly one of the more moderate Democrats, she says, in Congress, I am proud to represent New York's 21st District, home to the battles of Saratoga, Fort Ticonderoga, and Fort William Henry, one of the geographic cradles of the American Revolution. My husband and I live in Schuylerville, named after the Schuyler family, who are so brilliantly depicted in the musical masterpiece Hamilton. Honoring our nation's founding history, fought for and envisioned by the young, scrappy, and hungry, is part of our daily lives. Given this fabric of history embedded in upstate New York, my district truly cherishes our Constitution. Of particular personal meaning to me this year is the 19th Amendment, recognizing women's suffrage, which was passed by Congress 100 years ago. And then she just talks about women's suffrage as the part of the Constitution that matters most. Now listen, all for women's suffrage. It was passed by a bunch of Republicans, by the way. That's great. But still, no mention by anyone of the systemic Constitution. Pretty incredible. Pretty incredible. Cheryl Eiffel is the president and director counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund. She says, there's no passage in the Constitution that has done more to shape our modern conception of what it means to be American than the 14th Amendment. Now, this is true because that did shift the system, right? I mean, at least you can make the case for Stefanik that the 19th Amendment shifted the system. So did the 14th Amendment, guaranteeing birthright citizenship, articulating the promise of equality, fundamentally reordering the relationship between the federal government and the states, empowering Congress to pass laws to protect us against the prejudices of the states. All of this is right. Like, at least this lady knows what she's talking about. And she says, although these guarantees were focused on protecting African Americans, they've come to embody the rights that all Americans regard as inalienable. Since the amendment's ratification, these guarantees have been the basis upon which the political, economic, and social fabric of this country have been transformed many times over. And now, the extension of the 14th Amendment into areas that it was never meant to extend has been ridiculous. But she's not wrong that the 14th Amendment at least is important. I mean, at least that is the, at least that makes some sense. But the fact that there are so many Democrats who are not focused on the content of the Constitution, but it's high-flown rhetoric, those are people, if somebody focuses on the high-flown rhetoric and not the actual content of the Constitution, you're constitutioning wrong. Now, the reason I focus in on how the left interprets the Constitution is because the real guarantee of your safety, the real guarantee of your ability to act properly in American society with rights is the system. It's precisely the system that is currently under attack. It's been under attack since the progressive movement of the early 20th century. The progressive movement, which suggested that checks and balances were a thing of the past. Woodrow Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt talking about the big man, the president, able to override the boundaries of these checks and balances, these hackneyed checks and balances that stop us from doing what we would do. Woodrow Wilson famously suggested that the presidency is just as big as the man who holds the office. I mean, he said that when he was vying for the presidency, obviously. And this picture of the presidency is incredibly dangerous. It leads toward the path toward administrative dictatorship, and that's where we are right now. And ironically, as our focus on the Bill of Rights grows and our focus on the systemic Constitution fades and government becomes bigger, our rights are more under assault, not less under assault. We like to think of ourselves as having all sorts of rights, but all of the rights that we think of ourselves as having these days violate other rights that we were supposed to hold in the first place. So, for example, the left likes to claim that there is a right to health care, there's a right to higher education, there's a right to housing, there's a right to food, right? There are all these rights. But in order to make those rights guarantees, you have to invade the rights of others, to their property, to their liberty, to their labor. You have to invade those rights. The systemic Constitution was specifically designed to restrict the power of the government to invade those rights. But by focusing in on the words rights and not focusing in on what the government was supposed to not do, we have been able to overthrow the constitutional system as a whole while pretending that we're fulfilling its mandates. And that obviously is untrue. We're not fulfilling the mandates of the Constitution. We are more and more every day invading the mandates of the Constitution. And it's really gross. We're doing it in the name of the Constitution if you're on the political left these days. So Bernie Sanders keeps making this claim over and over and over in virtually all of his speeches. And the claim is that 500,000 Americans this year will go bankrupt from medical bills. The idea is that the American medical system is garbage. And because our system is garbage, therefore, people are going bankrupt. That basically everybody's doing fine until somebody gets sick, and then it costs so much to try and get that person better that people are going bankrupt. Well, it turns out the statistic is basically a bunch of garbage. And the Washington Post fact-checked the statistic, and then people got mad at the Washington Post because you must never fact-check Bernie Sanders. Stop that. Stop that, you. So Rolling Stone has a whole piece called The Washington Post's Latest Fact-Check of Bernie Sanders is Really Something by Tim Dickinson. It says, why did the paper's fact-checker call Bernie Sanders' accurate claim about medical bankruptcies mostly false? They say the Washington Post has a political fact-checking department, and the aim is admirable, to hold candidates accountable. The Post piece gives Sanders 3 Pinocchios for the claim on medical debt, which is the paper's shorthand for mostly false. To have earned the 3 Pinocchios, we must assume Bernie's claim is a real doozy, one wooden puppet short of a whopper, per the Post. So what's the matter with the stat? As it turns out, nothing much at all. Sanders' team told the Post that the Vermont senator was relying on an estimate published in a medical journal that found that 66.5% of bankruptcy filers cited either medical bills or missed work due to illness as a reason they went broke. The journal itself said this was equivalent to about 530,000 medical bankruptcies annually. At first glance, it appears Bernie understated the problem by rounding down. So what exactly was wrong with the study? Well, according to the Rolling Stone, nothing was wrong with the study. It was all fine. Everything was great. Well, not so much. Megan McArdle, who does an excellent job of breaking this sort of stuff down for a living over at the Washington Post, she's sort of a data person, she had an entire Twitter thread in which she explains why this is complete garbage. She says, first, the researchers whom Sanders is relying on are co-founders of the Physicians for a National Health Program, an organization which long predates their interest in bankruptcy, medical or otherwise. In other words, they're advocates for a single-payer health system, so they're advocates. They're not actual scholars first. She says, second, their work appears to be purpose-built to deliver the result that all bankruptcies are caused by medical events. Third, these particular scholars have not been as strenuous as they might in correcting the incredibly common misreading of their work, in which careless readers transmogrify illness-related into caused by medical bills. So they say that 66.5% of all bankruptcies are illness-related. Okay, and Bernie Sanders says that's because of medical bills. But that's not the same thing. McArdle says Canada has medical bankruptcy despite Medicare for all because if you get sick and you cannot work and you have a lot of debt, things go south pretty quickly. In other words, it ain't the medical bills, it's the fact that you can't work and then you go bankrupt. Right? If you get sick and your medical bills cost nothing because you live in Canada, but your taxpayer dollars, you still might go bankrupt because you're not working because you're sick. McArdle says this is how we get to the statistic, falsified even by the studies that allegedly support it, that more than half of all bankruptcies are caused by medical bills. Note that these studies do not say that the bankruptcies are caused by medical bills. The design can't possibly establish causation. But somehow people get that impression multiple times, and no one corrects it. What a puzzle. She says a couple more notes. First, the studies they did showed that having insurance did very little to protect you from a medical bankruptcy. They say that shows American health insurance is garbage. I say that shows their data is garbage. There is a non-trivial difference between having a high deductible and being on the hook for the entire cost of your quadruple bypass. If your study doesn't detect one, you did something wrong. Whatever you're studying, it isn't medical bankruptcy. In other words, if you have a high deductible, that is let's say you have a $10,000 deductible. That is not the same thing as being on the hook for $120,000 for a surgery for your heart. She says at the very least, this isn't studying medical bankruptcy caused by medical bills, which is the only problem that their national health program can solve. No health insurance program in the world fixes the problems of a self-employed plumber with a $500,000 house and multiple sclerosis. To believe that all of the medical bankruptcies they found are caused by medical bills, in the sense of none of these people would have declared bankruptcy except for having high medical bills, you have to believe that income loss is irrelevant. But you also have to believe that in the United States, only about 250,000 people declare bankruptcy for every other reason: job loss, divorce, small business failure, predatory lending, fraud, etc. Does that seem likely? Keeping in mind that the majority of very high-cost patients are already on Medicare because they're old? She says that stat should have never passed the sniff test. It's crazy. This is not to say that medical bills never cause bankruptcy or that isn't a problem worth addressing, but 500,000 is way too high for that number. Not least because bankruptcy is almost always multifactorial. It's people who have a lot of debt and then got divorced or sick or fired or sued. If they hadn't piled on the payments, they wouldn't be bankrupt. And also, if they hadn't been unlucky, they wouldn't be bankrupt. There's this endless debate in bankruptcy that boils down to unlucky or unwise. And the answer is embrace the healing power of and this is, of course, exactly right. But it is impressive how the media went to war with the Washington Post over making this very obvious point. And it is also a great indicator in how people can misuse statistics. So again, the basic point that Bernie Sanders was trying to make is that you went bankrupt because your medical bills were high. But he was doing it on the basis of a study that suggested that illness-related bankruptcy was medical bill-related. And that is not the case. That is not the case. The fact is, as Elizabeth Warren wrote in 2003, that bankruptcy is largely not caused by medical bills, right? It is caused by somebody losing a job. It is caused by somebody having an illness that takes them out of the job market. It is caused by taking on too much mortgage debt, for example. When you twist statistics in order to reach your glorious end, you're not doing anybody any favors. And it is a serious problem in American life right now because statistics can lie. Statistics can be used to lie. And Bernie Sanders is doing that right now as we speak. And the fact is that America's medical healthcare system and our outcomes are pretty good. They are. Everyone likes to talk about how bad America's healthcare system is. This is inaccurate. America's healthcare system is actually quite good overall, particularly for people who have employer-based healthcare insurance. And we do have effectively a universal healthcare system through Medicare and Medicaid. And the people who are falling through the cracks, by and large, a lot of those people are opting out of the individual healthcare market, which is why when the individual mandate went away, so many people dropped out. Well, it's always delightful when folks on the left finally just spill it out, when they reveal their agenda. It's one of the things I love so much about Bernie Sanders, just as a candidate, is that he has no brain-to-mouth filter. Whatever just goes through that crazy old balding head just comes right out through the front of the face. And it's pretty spectacular. Well, another person who is like this is the aptly named Charles Blow over at the New York Times, who has a piece today called Stop Lying About Gun Control. Now, when I read that title, I figured that this piece would be about Republicans lying about gun control and how gun control is totally going to work. But no, actually, the piece is Charles Blow telling Democrats, you should just call for full-scale gun confiscation. And I agree with that. I think Democrats should just spell out what exactly it is that they want. Charles Blow says, Beto O'Rourke has easily emerged as my favorite presidential candidate on the issue of gun control. Beto O'Rourke was like, yeah, brah, that's rad. Blow says, he has done so because he is speaking openly, passionately, and honestly. about what he would like to do to stem our epidemic of gun violence, a stance that is surprisingly rare in my estimation. Charles Blow is one of the worst writers in America. for a variety of reasons, including the fact that in an opinion column for the New York Times, he includes the phrase, in my estimation. It's an opinion column. I figured it was in your estimation, not my estimation. Sort of got that part. I long ago tired of hearing politicians who are supposed to be in favor of smarter gun laws and reducing American gun deaths and injuries pull their punches so as not to upset the gun lobby and gun lobbyists. Among other things, O'Rourke's gun safety plan includes declaring gun violence a public health emergency, creating a national gun licensing system and registry, requiring universal background checks, implementing red flag laws, and banning the manufacture, sale, and possession of military-style assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. Other candidates, says Blow, agree with some of these proposals, and others have additional ones. But I like the full-throated way O'Rourke responds to being challenged on this front. And so do I. As a conservative, I hope that the left just continues to spew out whatever their true bad ideas are. Not like the half-bad ideas where they pretend that there are no costs to their policies, but the ones where like, yeah, we want your guns and we're coming for them. See what you do. Let's see what you're going to do about it. We're coming. Blow's totally into it. This week in Charlottesville, a reporter asked O'Rourke, quote, how do you address the fears that the government is going to take away those assault rifles if you are talking about buybacks and banning? And O'Rourke said, I want to be really clear that that's exactly what we're going to do. Americans who own AR-15s, AK-47s will have to sell them to the government. First of all, I'm not sure who owns an AK-47. That's a fully automatic machine gun. He doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. He says, we're not going to allow them to stay on our streets, to show up in our communities. Right here's O'Rourke saying just that a couple of days ago.
How do you address the fears that the government is going to take away those assault rifles, as you call them, if you're talking about buybacks and banning?
Yeah. So I want to be really clear that that's exactly what we're going to do. Americans who own AR-15s, AK-47s, will have to sell them to the government. We're not going to allow them to stay on our streets, to show up in our communities.
Oh, well, I mean, as long as you just declare it, Beto O'Rourke. So this is what Blow loves. He loves that Beto O'Rourke just said this out loud. He says this is not the first time O'Rourke's buyback plan has been challenged. 2 weeks ago, the USA Today editorial board complained, quote, anything smacking of confiscation would breathe life and energy into the not from my cold dead hands crowd, endangering law enforcement and likely putting a full stop to any further gun safety measures. When asked this week on CNN about that criticism, O'Rourke responded, this triangulation, calculation, poll testing every move, that's what got us here in the first place. And then Charles Blow writes, literally a breath of fresh air, or finally a breath of fresh air. Listen, I don't know if O'Rourke's full slate of gun policies are all right, but I do know that we have to start taking deliberate and thoughtful action to deal with this problem. This is my favorite part of a bad opinion column, is where they're like, I don't know if any of the things he's saying make sense, but shouldn't we have a conversation about a bunch of nonsensical crap for no reason? Blow says, for instance, a mandatory buyback could be met with a constitutional challenge. A voluntary buyback might be most doable. The scope of the problem is enormous. According to a Washington Post report in 2018, there are more than 393 million civilian-owned firearms in the United States, or enough for every man, woman, and child to own one, and still have 67 million guns left over. Furthermore, the New York Times reported there were nearly 40,000 gun deaths in 2017, up by more than 1,000 from the year before. Nearly 2/3 were suicides, which, I mean, first of all, would speak to maybe you should only be talking about gun homicides, correct? But Blow says, to my mind, the goal is as simple as the task is daunting. We must reduce the overall number of guns in the population, especially those considered weapons of war. No definition. We must shrink the market desire for new weapons. How? And we must set a course to, by the way, you want to shrink the market desire for new weapons? You're going to have to stop trying to confiscate the old ones. Like every time you say you want to take an AR-15 from me, I don't own an AR-15. It makes me want to buy an AR-15. Specifically because I don't want you controlling what kind of weapon I can own. Charles Blow, he says, we must set a course to not only pass a new law in a moment, but build in the expectation that federal legislation around guns will be the never-ending, ever-adjusting reality. He says, people interested in reducing gun violence in America have to stop lying about what that would require. He says, the opponents are right in some of their arguments. Can I or anyone else point to a specific proposal and say it would have affected this or that specific mass shooting? Occasionally, yes, but often not. But that's not the point. The point is to see a reduction in all shootings. Yes, but again, you have no evidence that you're actually going to accomplish that. The greatest reduction in shootings in American history happened between 1994 and 2015, when the number of guns in American society radically increased. But the point is this. Charles Blow basically is calling for the left to be upfront about simply taking guns. He says the people resisting regulation say that any new legislation is a slippery slope for an aggressive agenda to massively restrict guns. I say my great desire is to thoroughly hose that slope with oil. More of this. Please, more of this honesty. Because if you want Americans to know what the left is up to, it'd be great if they just spoke honestly about what it is they are up to. Now, hilariously enough, Beto O'Rourke has been ripping on my friend Meghan McCain. So Meghan McCain is on The View. And she said the other day that it is ridiculous to talk about confiscating vast numbers of weapons because a lot of people are going to get violent when you try to take their guns away from them. She said the AR-15 is by far the most popular gun in America. If you're talking about taking people's guns, there's going to be a lot of violence. That is 100% true. That is 100% true. I mean, I know people from Texas. I live in LA. I know people from Texas. I know people from Oklahoma. I know people from lots of places in the middle of the country where the women of The View would never set foot, that flyover country, where they truly believe correctly that the Second Amendment was designed to protect you from government predations in part, and that the purpose of owning a gun is to stop the government from taking your gun. That the chief point of the spear when it comes to tyranny is the government grabbing your gun. If you really think that you're going to go to 20, 30 million households in America that own maybe 100 million rifles and say to them, yeah, we're just going to take your gun away from you today, and that's going to go just fantastic, good luck with that. Good luck with that. Also, it is constantly amazing to me that so many of the people who are sanguine about gun control policies have been at the mercy of the government gun on many other occasions. I mean, the fact is that one of the chief groups in America that should be very much in favor of private gun ownership are groups that have been historically discriminated against in America. Because the last thing you want is a government that could be turned against you, taking away your ability to protect yourself. But Beto O'Rourke decided to inject himself here. He said, well, now she's incentivizing violence. So in other words, it doesn't create the possibility of violence when you suggest that you are going to take away hundreds of millions of guns from hundreds of millions of Americans at the point of a gun. That doesn't increase the chances of violence. But me pointing out that it increases the chances of violence, it's that sort of verbiage that increases the chances of violence, obviously. That's what Beto O'Rourke said today. He said that rhetoric is not helpful. It becomes self-fulfilling. Really? You think people in Texas were waiting around for me to point out that they might not like it when someone steals their guns from them? I mean, this is such ignorant stupidity. Meghan McCain not only didn't say anything wrong, she said something that is obviously true. Also, there's something quite amazing about a person who drove drunk, as Dana Lash points out, and nearly killed someone, and then tried to flee the scene talking about violent rhetoric and the possibility of violence arising from you pointing out that it might, in fact, have a blowback effect if you try to steal hundreds of millions of guns from hundreds of millions of Americans. Pretty impressive stuff. The New York Times is also out there today ripping on Amazon. Why? Well, because Amazon uses independent contractors to deliver its packages. Thus, Amazon is very bad. Now, you might be saying to yourself, wait a second. Didn't Amazon used to use the post office a lot? Were they responsible for the post office getting in car crashes? The answer was no. Didn't Amazon sometimes use FedEx? Isn't it weird to blame Amazon for FedEx getting in car crashes? Yes, that is a weird thing. But now the New York Times is trying to claim that it is very, very bad that Amazon hires private people as independent contractors to drive on a part-time basis and then is not responsible for those drivers hitting people in the course of delivering packages. They say you can't hold Amazon accountable because the company shields itself from liability for accidents involving the drivers who deliver its billions of packages a year. According to the New York Times, in its relentless push for e-commerce dominance, Amazon has built a huge logistics operation in recent years, but to get more goods to customers' homes in less and less time. As it moves to reduce its reliance on legacy carriers like UPS, the retailer has created a network of contractors across the country that allows the company to expand and shrink the delivery force as needed while avoiding the cost of taking on permanent employees. But as Amazon's promise of speedy delivery has come at a price, one largely hidden from public view. An investigation by ProPublica identified more than 60 accidents since June 2015 involving Amazon delivery contractors that resulted in serious injuries, including 10 deaths. That tally is most likely a fraction of the accidents that have occurred. Even as Amazon argues that it bears no legal responsibility for the human toll, it maintains a tight grip on how delivery drivers do their jobs. Their paychecks are signed by hundreds of companies, of course, but often Amazon directs through an app the order of the deliveries and the route to each destination. Yes, this is what it's called to have a delivery company do your delivering for you. So here's the question. What exactly is the alternative proposal? Did they bother to check out whether or not Amazon has created additional traffic accidents over, for example, UPS? Like when they were using UPS, when they were using FedEx, were there fewer traffic accidents? Because if not, then what the hell are you talking about? They're just using different subcontractors. They're just not using the big ones. So what exactly is the problem? The problem, of course, is Amazon. Amazon's a big company. That means they're evil, and it means they're bad. And this means that they must be taken down a peg. And we must force them. We must force them to own the liability for independent contractors, which, of course, is incredibly silly because there are independent businesses that are making payroll based on Amazon shipping their packages. But you get big enough and the media will come after you pretty much no matter what, apparently. This is a very long article from the New York Times, again, trying to blame Amazon for these car crashes, even though they're subcontracting with people. And it's bizarre. It's bizarre, honestly. It's them trying to blame big companies for nothing of real note. Amazon has done nothing wrong by subcontracting with a local contractor in LA to deliver packages instead of UPS. That's just incredibly, incredibly silly. All right, coming up in a little while, we'll be joined by Dennis Miller. Plus, we'll be discussing the Democrats' climate change debate. It went for 7 hours last night. If 7 hours of climate change talk sounds phenomenal to you, I need to recommend that you get a life. I mean, I think it would be a significant upgrade for you to become obsessed with Magic the Gathering. I've asked producer Nick about it. He says way better than watching 7 hours of Democrats talking about climate change. Also, we could order you some sort of blow-up doll. Like, something has to be done. If you sat there watching 7 hours of climate change TV on CNN last night and you weren't paid to do so, I don't know what to tell you, man. You need to figure out something with your life because something is going deeply wrong in every possible way with your life. I mean, I don't mean to rip on you, but I absolutely mean to rip on you. The good news is, if you stick around for a little while, then we are going to recap everything. The short story is the Democrats are going to try and ban everything, like all the things, except for the blow-up dolls. They have to keep you happy somehow. So some bad news for President Trump in some of the swing states. Again, these are very early polls. We always take them with a grain of salt, and Joe Biden may not be the nominee. In fact, I think that if you had to place odds on Biden versus the field, you would assume that Joe Biden probably is not the nominee at this point. But the polls for President Trump in the swing states are pretty ugly at this point in time. According to the Washington Post, a new poll finds that former VP Joe Biden leads President Trump by 9 percentage points in a hypothetical general election matchup in Wisconsin. Trump carried that state narrowly in 2016. He really does have to win it. He needs to win at least one of Wisconsin, Michigan, or Pennsylvania. Biden leads Trump 51-42 among registered Wisconsin voters in the Marquette University Law School poll released Wednesday. The poll also shows another Democratic White House hopeful, Bernie Sanders, with a slight lead over Trump, 48-44. Two other Democrats, Warren and Harris, are tied with Trump at 45 and 44%, respectively, which does show you that the worst thing Democrats could do is nominate a radical. They nominate a radical, and Trump has a very, very solid shot at re-election. They nominate Joe Biden, slow old Joe. And things may work out just fine, because after all, he has 100% name recognition. Everybody finds him relatively non-threatening, although I think that is an exaggeration of who Joe Biden is. The fact is that Joe Biden seems unthreatening, and that is a bad thing for the primaries and a very good thing for the general election for them. I mean, how do you find this guy threatening? I mean, here's Joe Biden doddering around on Stephen Colbert's show last night.
You want to talk about issues, but a lot of people want to talk about your gaffes. You have called yourself a gaffe machine, okay? You in the last few weeks, you've confused New Hampshire for Vermont, said Bobby Kennedy and MLK were assassinated in the late 70s, assured us I'm not going nuts. Follow-up question, are you going nuts?
Look, the reason I came on the Jimmy Kimmel show is because I'm not.
Okay, so do you really find that guy threatening? This is the problem for Trump. The more doddering, the more unthreatening, the more sort of ridiculously non-entity the Democrat seems, the better the Democrat does in a general election, because then the contrast is between a block of wood and President Trump. But if the contrast is between President Trump and crazy Elizabeth Warren, who used to be interesting, but now is just Bernie Sanders, but school-marming you at an HOA meeting, that is not going to go well for Democrats in the same way that Joe Biden will go well for Democrats. In 2016, Trump did carry Wisconsin over Hillary Clinton by less than 1 percentage point. Wisconsin is among 4 states political analysts say are most likely to determine the result of 2020. Many of those analysts say that Wisconsin is most pivotal. That's probably right. I think that if Trump wins Wisconsin, then he wins the election, because I doubt that he loses Florida but wins Wisconsin. That would be weird. The poll also finds that Biden is the best positioned in the Democratic primary. Right now, he's the first choice of 28% of registered Democrats, Sanders second at 20, followed by Warren at 17, Buttigieg at 6, and Harris at 3. Speaking of Pete Buttigieg, by the way, Pete Buttigieg, I don't know when he decided to become the obnoxious prayer leader from your church, but he really did. But he did it. He's really awful. I mean, he one of the things that Pete Buttigieg used to be was amusing. He seemed like a nice guy. Like very early on in his campaign, he was the guy who's like, yeah, you know what? Fine, I'll go to Chick-fil-A. What do I care? Right? I'm happy in my life. Like, I'm gay, I'm married, deal with it, whatever, man. Live your life. And I was like, all right, that kind of, honestly, kind of a draw. And then he was like, also, Jesus hates you. They're like, whoa, where did that come from, man? What the heck? He's like, as a gay married man, Jesus thinks you're the worst. And it's like, what? This is your pitch? This right here? As a man who supports abortion up to the point of birth, I say that Jesus despises you. And you're like, whoa. So you're, let me just get this straight. Your pitch is that religious bigots hate you, and also you're a religious bigot who hates people. That's weird. Pete Buttigieg today, he said a reckoning was coming over the GOP and Christianity. A reckoning. Hey, dude, you're not Wyatt Earp. He says Republicans will face a reckoning over a policy agenda he says is out of sync with Christian values. He keeps doing this. He was on Morning Joe on Thursday, and he keeps highlighting his Christian faith. No one, does he think a single Democrat in the primaries is like, you know what, that Pete Buttigieg, he seems like a good Christian, I'm voting for him. You know, with all the abortion, the gay marriage and stuff. Totally into it in the Democratic primary. I think he is missing that the Venn diagram of people who really want to inject religious values into politics and base their politics on religious values, and Democrats who like Pete Buttigieg, there is no crossover in that Venn diagram. Like none. It makes progressive Democrats feel good about themselves because then they get to call Republicans hypocrites, I guess. I guess that's the pitch. He says Republicans are known for beating people on the head with their faith. And he will tell you that while beating them on the head with their faith. He says there's going to be a reckoning over that. Nothing says, I'm going to charm the pants off Christians quite like, I hate you and you're a bad Christian because you don't support my political agenda that also runs absolutely contrary to most of the dictates of the Old and New Testament. It's a power move, man. I will say that. Now, I don't want to be too sanguine about the Republican hopes in 2020 right now. Another Texas Republican just announced that he will not be running. That is Representative Bill Flores. Jim Sensenbrenner from Wisconsin also became the highest-ranking Republican to announce his retirement. There's talk about maybe this being an early indicator that Republicans think they will run weak in 2020. Cook Political Report's Dave Wasserman said, to the extent Democrats can pick up a few insurance seats, it makes it a lot harder for Republicans to take control of the House. But the truth is that Flores and Sensenbrenner are both in relatively safe districts for Republicans. Meanwhile, few Democrats are stepping out. They think that Trump is going to drag down the ticket. Well, we will see. That may not be the case if the Democrats continue to run this radically. Alrighty, coming up, we're going to be talking with our good friend Dennis Miller. He'll be stopping by to assess everything from the Democrats on climate change to the attacks on Dave Chappelle, who's apparently a very bad man for making things called jokes. This is The Ben Shapiro Show.